The Millionaire'S triplets were mute, until a poor elderly woman changed their destiny. For years, no one dared to speak about what really happened behind the gates of that silent mansion. Everything began when the girls, always quiet, noticed an elderly woman sitting on the sidewalk, alone, dirty and motionless. That same afternoon, for the first time, they spoke, and nobody could understand how that stranger broke a silence that even science couldn't explain. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Now, on with the story. The mansion stood imposing on Pine Street, in the heart of Kensington, London. It was a structure that breathed history and old money, with its wrought iron gates, impeccable gardens, and a facade that blended classicism with touches of discreet modernity. Behind those high walls, however, lived a silence that no architect had planned, no interior designer could disguise. It was a silence that came not from the absence of sounds, but from the lack of something far more essential: words, voices, the simple melody of a child calling for her father. Marshall Ames was 42, his hair already graying at the temples, and his eyes seeming to carry a bottomless exhaustion. A civil engineer by training, heir to a family construction firm that had erected a good portion of West London's commercial buildings, he had always been a man of practical solutions. Problems had causes. Causes had corrections. That was how the world he grew up in worked. But here, in this house that had once been filled with laughter and future plans, the rules no longer seemed to apply. Here, logic had surrendered to the inexplicable. The triplets had just turned 5, Sophia, Laura, and Helena, 3 identical girls, with straight brown hair that fell to their shoulders, honey-colored eyes, and a smile that, when it appeared, could light up any room. But that smile was never accompanied by sound. No laughter echoed down the marble staircase. No calls echoed through the wide corridors. No requests, no complaints, no words of affection. Only gestures, deep gazes, a communication that seemed encrypted, accessible only among the 3 of them, as if they shared a secret language that the rest of the world would never comprehend. Marshall remembered with painful clarity the day he realized something was different. The girls were a year and a half old, and while other children were starting to babble Mama and Dada, his daughters remained in absolute mutism. At first, he and Beatrice, his wife, attributed it to their being triplets. Perhaps their development was naturally slower. Perhaps the communication between them fulfilled the need to speak to adults. But the months passed, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and nothing changed. Then came the specialists. Renowned neurologists from the London clinic examined every millimeter of the girls' brains through MRIs and CT scans. Nothing, absolutely nothing abnormal. Speech therapists dedicated months to exercises, stimuli, and elaborate games designed to provoke some vocal reaction. The girls participated, smiled, imitated lip movements, but never uttered a sound. Child psychologists investigated trauma, emotional blocks, and autism spectrum disorders. Again, nothing. The girls showed affection, interacted socially within their means, and perfectly understood what was said to them. They simply did not speak. And then Beatrice left. Not abruptly or tragically, but slowly and silently, like a candle consuming itself down to the last thread of wax. A degenerative disease that the doctors called by a complicated name, but which Marshall summarized in his heart as the thief of everything he loved. She passed away one June morning, 2 years ago, leaving behind a shattered husband and 3 daughters who seemed to understand the absence, through an instinct that required no explanation. In the following days, the girls began to sleep huddled together, something they had not done before. They began to draw the same figure over and over, a woman with long hair holding hands with 3 little girls. Marshall kept these drawings in a box in his office, unable to throw them away, unable to look at them for too long. Life moved on like a rusty gear. Marshall hired Mrs. Davies, an experienced nanny from Yorkshire, who cared for the girls with genuine affection but could not break through that invisible barrier. He also hired Julianne, a young educator specializing in special education, who came 3 times a week for cognitive stimulation sessions. The girls liked her, but they did not speak. Marshall immersed himself in work, taking on increasingly complex projects, traveling frequently, as if physical distance could cushion the pain of the emotional distance he felt from his own daughters. He knew it was cowardly. He knew he was running away. But he didn't know how to do otherwise. It was an August afternoon, with a grey sky typical of a London winter, when everything began to change. Marshall was returning from a meeting at the construction company's office located in Canary Wharf when Mrs. Davies greeted him at the door with a puzzled expression. The girls, she said, were behaving strangely, very agitated, jumping, clapping their hands, pointing to the living room window that faced the street. Marshall went to the spacious room, decorated with light-colored sofas and a bookshelf filled with books no one read anymore. The three of them were pressed against the glass, their little faces against the cold surface, their fingers pointing insistently at something outside. He approached and looked in the indicated direction. There, on the other side of the gate, sitting under the leafy mulberry tree that grew on the pavement in front of the mansion, was an elderly woman. She wasn't asking for anything. She didn't hold out her hand, hold up a sign, or make any movements to attract attention. She was simply there, sitting on a worn plaid blanket, leaning against the wide trunk of the tree. She wore simple, clean clothes, a long brown skirt, a beige long-sleeved blouse, and a grey wool shawl over her shoulders. Her hair, completely white, was tied in a low bun. Beside her a shabby fabric bag and a small faded blue backpack. Her eyes were closed, as if she were resting or praying. Perhaps both. Marshall frowned. It wasn't uncommon to see homeless people in that area, although the neighborhood tried, with a certain veiled insistence, to maintain an image of exclusivity that didn't align with the presence of those who didn't fit the expected standard. But something about that scene was different. The woman didn't seem lost or desperate. There was an almost disconcerting serenity about her, as if that spot under the tree was exactly where she was meant to be. What truly intrigued Marshall, however, was his daughter's reaction. Sophia, the most observant of the three, began to wave through the window. Laura clapped her hands rhythmically. Helena, normally the shyest, made gestures as if she were calling the woman, inviting her to look up. And, most impressively, all three were smiling, a wide, genuine smile that Marshall hadn't seen in months. Mrs. Davies approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She also looked outside with an expression that mixed curiosity with a hint of suspicion. "I saw her this morning when I took the girls to the park," she whispered. "She was already there. Didn't say anything to us, just waved from a distance. The girls have been like this ever since. I couldn't get them away from the window." Marshall watched for a few more moments. The woman remained motionless, her eyes closed, oblivious to the world around her, or pretending to be. There was something about her that sparked a strange familiarity, as if he had seen her before, somewhere he couldn't place. But that was unlikely. He knew few people outside his work circle and old friendships that, since Beatrice's passing, had become increasingly distant. "I'm not calling the police," he decided. "At least not now. If she's not bothering anyone, let her be." Mrs. Davies nodded, but her expression remained one of disapproval. Marshall turned his attention back to his daughters. "Come on, girls, dinner's almost ready. Let's get away from the window." But they didn't move. They remained there, hypnotized, as if watching the most fascinating show they had ever witnessed. That night Marshall had trouble sleeping. He tossed and turned in the king-size bed that seemed too big, too empty, too cold. He thought about the woman under the tree. He thought about his daughters. He thought about Beatrice. How would she have handled this? What would she have said? Beatrice always had the right words, the right intuition. She would have known how to decipher what this meant, but Beatrice was no longer there. And Marshall, alone, felt completely lost. The next morning the woman was still in the same place. Marshall saw her as he left for work, now sitting facing the house, her eyes open but not fixed on anything specific. She held a dented aluminum mug from which she drank something slowly. As he passed through the gate, Marshall hesitated. Should he say something? Ask if she needed help? Offer something? But something stopped him. It wasn't fear nor indifference. It was a strange feeling that any interference from him could break something delicate, something that was forming without him fully understanding what. When he returned in the afternoon, the scene repeated itself. The girls at the window waving, the woman under the tree now looking directly at them. And then something happened that made Marshall stop the car abruptly and get out without turning off the engine. The woman made a gesture with her hand. A simple movement. She brought her hand to her heart and then extended her open palm towards the girls, and the three of them simultaneously imitated the gesture with perfect precision, as if they knew exactly what to do, as if they had done it before. Marshall entered the house with a racing heart. "Mrs. Davies, what does this mean? Do you understand any of it?" The nanny shook her head, equally perplexed. "I've never seen the girls react like this to anyone, Mr. Ames, not even to Julianne, who's been working with them for over a year. It's as if they know that lady from somewhere." But how? The girls barely left the house besides trips to the park and the special school they attended 3 mornings a week. They had no contact with strangers. They lived in a controlled, safe, predictable world. How could they have any connection with a woman who apparently lived on the streets? The following days brought an unexpected routine. The woman remained under the mulberry tree, sometimes sitting, sometimes lying on the blanket. In the morning, she would disappear for a few hours, always returning before noon. Marshall found out through the doorman of a neighboring building that she used to frequent a day center on King's Road, where she could shower and get some food. But she always came back, always to the same spot, always under the same tree. And the girls, more fascinated each day. Sophia started bringing her drawings to the window, showing them to the woman through the glass. Laura hummed wordless melodies, swaying her body, and the woman seemed to follow with subtle head movements. Helena, the shyest, simply stood there watching, with an expression of peace that Marshall had never seen on his daughter's face. It was Julianne, the educator, who verbalized what everyone was beginning to notice. "Mr. Ames, I can't explain it, but the girls are different. They're more present, more connected. Today, during our session, Sophia held my hand and pulled me to the window, as if she wanted to show me something important. That's never happened before. They're trying to communicate in a new way." Marshall knew he had to do something. The situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Sooner or later, someone in the neighborhood would complain, or the woman herself would leave, following the uncertain path of those with no fixed destination. And then, what would happen to his daughters? Would they revert to their previous state? Would they get worse? He couldn't risk it. It was a rainy Friday when Marshall finally decided to act. The girls were already asleep, and he went down to the kitchen to make coffee, unable to rest. Through the window he saw the woman was still there, sheltered by a makeshift raincoat made of tied plastic bags. Something inside him broke. That scene, of such fragile dignity under the storm, echoed something deep he couldn't name. He grabbed a large umbrella, put on a jacket, and went out the side door that led directly to the street. He went through the gate and walked to the mulberry tree. The woman raised her eyes as he approached. They were light eyes, bluish bright despite her age. Eyes that had seen a great deal, eyes that carried stories. "Good evening," Marshall said, holding the umbrella over her. "It's raining hard. Wouldn't you like to come inside? I can make you some hot tea." The woman watched him for a long moment, as if evaluating not just the offer, but the soul of the one making it. Then, in a voice that was hoarse but surprisingly firm, she replied, "I don't want to be a bother. I'm fine here." "Your daughters," Marshall said, a lump forming in his throat. "They watch you all day. I don't know what you've done or what they see, but I've never seen them so attentive to anyone. Please, it's no bother. It's a request." The woman hesitated. Her expression hardened for an instant, as if she were about to refuse. But then something changed. Perhaps it was the sincerity in Marshall's voice. Perhaps it was the weariness of so many nights in the open. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it was something she didn't fully understand either. An invisible force pulling her towards that house, towards those children, towards a purpose that had not yet fully revealed itself. "All right," she said finally, gathering her few belongings. "Just for tonight. I'll be gone." First thing in the morning, Marshall nodded, but deep down he knew that wasn't true. Something was beginning, something neither of them controlled, and as the woman passed through the gate and stepped onto the impeccable garden of that mansion, As her worn soles touched the stone path leading to the main door, the silence of the house trembled, as if sensing its days were numbered. Marshall led her to the kitchen, spacious and modern, with marble countertops and state-of-the-art appliances that seemed out of place before this simple, timeless figure. He made chamomile tea, served biscuits, and offered a clean towel for her to dry her face and hands. The woman accepted everything in silence, with a quiet politeness that hinted at origins that might have once been different. "What's your name?" Marshall asked, sitting across from her at the large dining table. The woman took a sip of tea before answering. "Amelia. You can call me Mrs. Amelia." Marshall nodded. "I'm Marshall, and the girls you saw at the window are Sophia, Laura, and Helena, my daughters." "Triplets," Mrs. Amelia observed, in a tone that was not a question but a statement. Marshall confirmed. "Yes. 5 years old. All three." There was a comfortable silence. Mrs. Amelia seemed to be weighing how much she should ask, how much she should reveal. "Why don't they play in the garden? I only see them at the window." Marshall felt the weight of that question. "They are special. They have some difficulties. They prefer to stay inside. It's safer." Mrs. Amelia looked at him with an intensity that made him feel transparent. "Safer for them or for you?" The question cut deep. Marshall didn't know how to answer. "Perhaps for both of us," he finally admitted, surprised by his own honesty. Mrs. Amelia finished her tea and set the cup down gently. "Children need space to breathe," she said, not in a judgmental tone, but as one stating a fact. "They need to feel the wind, the earth, the sun. Otherwise, they get trapped in a world that isn't their own." Marshall swallowed hard. She was right. But how could he explain that he kept his daughters inside not out of cruelty, but out of fear? Fear that the world would hurt them, fear of not being able to protect them, fear of losing them too. Mrs. Davies appeared in the kitchen, still in her dressing gown. "Mr. Ames, is everything all right?" He turned and nodded. "Yes, Mrs. Davies. This is Mrs. Amelia. She'll be spending the night. Could you prepare the guest room, please?" The nanny looked from her employer to the visitor, clearly surprised, but nodded and went upstairs to prepare the room. Marshall stood up. "I'll show you where you'll be sleeping. We'll talk more tomorrow." But as they went up the stairs and past the girls' room, something extraordinary happened. The door was ajar and Marshall could see the 3 beds lined up with the small bodies, asleep under the white blankets. Mrs. Amelia stopped, just stopped looking in. And then, so subtly that Marshall almost missed it, she whispered something, words he didn't understand. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps a greeting, perhaps a promise. And inside the room Helena stirred. She turned in her bed, still asleep, and smiled. A small but unmistakable smile. Marshall felt a shiver run down his spine. What was happening here? Who was this woman? And why, for the first time in years, did he feel a glimmer of something that had not visited his heart for a long time? Hope. Fragile. Uncertain but present. Like a candle lit on a stormy night, flickering in the wind but refusing to go out. The morning arrived with a different kind of light. Marshall woke early, as always, but this time it wasn't the alarm that pulled him from sleep, but a sound he hadn't heard in that house for a long time. Light footsteps in the hallway, followed by the discreet shuffling of chairs. Someone was awake before him. Someone was moving through the house with the familiarity of one who belonged in that space. He came downstairs, still in his pajamas, his hair disheveled, and found the most unlikely scene he could imagine. In the kitchen, Mrs. Amelia was already dressed in the same simple clothes from yesterday, now dry and minimally smoothed out. She was making coffee on the old stove, using the Italian coffee pot that had belonged to Beatrice's mother, and which no one had used since his wife had passed. The intense aroma filled the room, bringing with it memories of happy mornings that seemed to belong to another life. "Good morning," Marshall said, still processing the scene. "Did you sleep well?" Mrs. Amelia turned, and for the first time he could observe her more closely in the natural light. She must have been in her late 70s, maybe even 80, but there was an erect posture to her, a quiet vitality that defied numbers. Her light eyes shone with intelligence, and the wrinkles on her face seemed to tell stories that went far beyond what she would ever reveal. "I slept well, thank you for your hospitality," she replied, pouring 2 cups of coffee. "I hope I haven't been a nuisance." Marshall shook his head, accepting the hot drink. "Not at all. In fact, I should be thanking you. It's been a long time since I've had coffee made like this." Mrs. Amelia gave a half smile. "I learned from the nuns at the orphanage where I grew up. They used to say that bad coffee is a venial sin." Marshall chuckled, surprised by the sound of it. When was the last time he had truly laughed inside that house? "You grew up in an orphanage?" Mrs. Amelia nodded, taking a sip of her own coffee. "I spent my childhood there. Then I was adopted by a family in the countryside in Windsor. That's where I studied, became a teacher and started working with children." Her voice carried a neutral tone, as if she were recounting facts from a book read long ago, not from her own life. Before Marshall could ask more, they heard a noise upstairs. It was the girls waking up. Mrs. Davies was starting the morning routine, calling each one by name, helping them get dressed. Marshall looked at the clock. It was Saturday, which meant no school, no therapy. A free day. A day when, normally, the girls would spend hours in their room, playing among themselves in their silent, impenetrable world. But today, something was different. The little footsteps came down the stairs faster than usual, almost running. And when Sophia appeared in the kitchen, with Laura and Helena right behind, all still in pajamas with their hair loose and messy, they stopped at the entrance. They stopped and stared at Mrs. Amelia. The silence that followed was not the usual kind. It was charged, dense, as if the very air was holding its breath. Mrs. Amelia slowly put down her cup and knelt to the girls' level. "Good morning, little ones," she said with a voice that suddenly sounded different, softer, more musical, as if accessing a register she had kept hidden for a long time. The 3 remained motionless, their eyes wide. Sophia, the boldest, took a step forward, then another. And then she ran. She ran and threw herself into Mrs. Amelia's arms with a force that almost knocked her over. Laura and Helena followed immediately. In seconds, all 3 were clinging to the old woman, hugging her with an intensity that brought tears to Marshall's eyes. Mrs. Davies, who had come down behind the girls, brought a hand to her mouth, equally shocked. Never, in 5 years of life, had those children shown such effusiveness with anyone. Not with their own father, not with their nanny, not with their therapists, with no one. Mrs. Amelia closed her eyes and wrapped the 3 of them in her thin but firm arms. She swayed gently, as if rocking babies, and murmured low words that Marshall couldn't distinguish. The girls weren't crying, but their bodies trembled with a contained emotion, as if they were releasing something they had held in for too long. The scene lasted for minutes that felt like hours. When they finally let go, something in the faces of all 4 had changed. A connection had been established, a silent pact, a mutual recognition. The day unfolded surreally. After breakfast, Marshall suggested they go into the garden. It was a beautiful day, with soft sun and a pleasant temperature, and he thought it would be good for the girls to get some fresh air. To his surprise, they agreed without resistance. More than that, they took Mrs. Amelia by the hands and pulled her outside, eager to show her everything. The swing set, the dollhouse, the small vegetable patch Mrs. Davies kept at the back. Marshall watched them from the veranda, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, unable to look away. Mrs. Amelia sat on the grass, something the girls never did spontaneously, and they spread out around her like the petals of a flower. The woman gathered leaves, twigs, and pebbles, and began to assemble small constructions, little houses, bridges, paths, and the girls participated, copied, and created their own versions. There were no words, but there was communication. Clear, fluid, natural. "Mr. Ames," Mrs. Davies called, joining him on the veranda. "Did you see this?" He nodded, unable to speak. "The key," Nanny continued, her voice choked with emotion. "In 5 years I've never seen them like this. It's as if that lady has a key that no one else has." Marshall agreed in silence. That was exactly it. A key. But to what door? And how had Mrs. Amelia gotten it? Lunch was prepared by Mrs. Davies, and everyone gathered in the dining room. Marshall insisted that Mrs. Amelia sit at the table with them, something she was reluctant to do, claiming it wouldn't be appropriate. But the girls would not accept any other arrangement. They pulled out the chair next. To them, slapped their hands on the table's surface and pointed at her insistently. Mrs. Amelia gave in, sitting with a dignity that turned the simple gesture into something almost ceremonial. During the meal, Marshall noticed details he hadn't seen before. The way Mrs. Amelia cut her food into small uniform pieces before eating. The way she taught the girls, through subtle gestures, to use their cutlery more properly. The patience with which she waited for each one to finish before taking the next bite. There was a refined upbringing there, hidden under layers of difficult years. In the afternoon, when the girls were taken to their room for their mandatory nap, Marshall finally had a chance to talk with Mrs. Amelia alone. They sat in the library, a room he rarely used, filled with books that Beatrice had collected throughout her life. The light filtered in through the heavy curtains, creating an almost intimate atmosphere. "Mrs. Amelia," Marshall began, choosing his words carefully, "I need to understand. What do you see in my daughters that no one else can see?" The woman remained silent for a long moment, looking out the window. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that went beyond the words. "I see children who have not been heard." Marshall frowned. "But I listen to them. We all do. The doctors, the therapists, the school." Mrs. Amelia shook her head gently. "To hear is not just to listen to sounds, Marshall. It is to perceive what is being said without words. It is to validate the way each person chooses to express themselves. Your daughters speak all the time. They just don't use their voices. And perhaps they don't use them because no one ever taught them that it's safe to do so." The observation hit Marshall like a punch to the gut. "Are you saying it's my fault?" "No," Mrs. Amelia replied firmly. "There is no blame here. There is only pain, unprocessed pain, unresolved loss. Children feel everything, Marshall. They feel more than we can imagine, and sometimes they choose silence as a way to protect those they love. Protect them from what? From their own pain, from the fear of losing someone else, from the terror that their words might bring more suffering." Marshall felt tears burn his eyes. "How do you know all this?" Mrs. Amelia sighed, and for the first time he saw a crack in her armor of serenity. "Because I have seen it before, many times." She then began to tell her story. She told him about the years she spent working in a small community in the countryside near Reading. There she had founded a school for children with communication difficulties. It wasn't an ordinary school, with desks in rows and blackboards. It was a place of acceptance, where each child was seen in their entirety, where therapy mixed with art, music, gardening, and cooking, where learning to speak was less important than learning to express oneself. "Do you still run this school?" Marshall asked, already imagining the possibility of taking his daughters there. Mrs. Amelia lowered her gaze, and her expression closed off. "No. The school no longer exists. There was a fire. I lost everything. The records, the materials, years of work. And the children. They were relocated to other institutions. I was never able to gather the resources to start over." The pain in her voice was palpable. Marshall realized he was in the presence of someone who carried deep scars, perhaps as deep as his own. "I'm so sorry," he said sincerely. Mrs. Amelia just nodded. "It was a long time ago. I learned to move on, to carry with me only the essentials." She touched the shawl she was wearing, as if it represented all her emotional baggage. In the following days, an unexpected routine was established. Mrs. Amelia remained in the house, occupying the guest room. Marshall didn't suggest she leave, and she didn't offer to go. There was a tacit agreement between them. As long as this was good for the girls, she would stay. The transformations were visible. Sophia began to use small sounds to get attention. Not words yet, but vocalizations, intentional sighs, hums and ahs that indicated approval or disagreement. Laura discovered music. Mrs. Amelia had brought a small, simple, worn wooden flute from her bag, and she played soft melodies in the afternoons. Laura would be mesmerized, swaying her body, and soon began to hum along, still without words, but with melody, with rhythm, with musical intent. Helena, the shyest, began to touch things, to feel textures. Mrs. Amelia taught her to name the world through touch, rough, soft, cold, hot. And although Helena didn't repeat the words out loud, her lips began to move, silently forming the syllables. Julianne, the educator, was astonished when she returned for her weekly session. "Mr. Ames, what happened? The girls are completely different. They're present in a way I've never seen before." Marshall explained about Mrs. Amelia, about the inexplicable connection. Julianne asked to meet her. The meeting between the two women was interesting. Julianne, young and full of academic theories, asked technical questions about methods, approaches, scientific foundations. Mrs. Amelia answered with disarming simplicity, "I don't have a method. I just listen. I am just present. The children do the rest." One evening, while Marshall was working, late in his office reviewing blueprints for a new development, Mrs. Amelia appeared at the door. "May I come in?" He nodded yes, pushing the papers aside. She sat in the leather armchair in front of the desk. "I need to tell you something, Marshall." He felt his stomach tighten. Something in her tone indicated that what was coming next would change everything. Mrs. Amelia took a deep breath. "You said your wife's name was Beatrice?" Marshall confirmed, intrigued. "Yes, Beatrice Carver Ames." "Why?" Mrs. Amelia's expression softened, and tears she didn't try to hide welled up in her eyes. "Because I knew a Beatrice many years ago, a girl who also didn't speak, a girl I helped." Marshall's heart pounded. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Amelia continued, her voice trembling. "It was in 1978, I think, maybe 79. I was working at a clinic in Windsor. A family came to me. They had a 7-year-old daughter who had stopped speaking after losing her mother. Selective mutism, they called it. I worked with her for 2 years. When we finished, she was speaking normally, making friends, living. The family moved to London afterwards and we lost touch, but I never forgot that girl. I never forgot her name. Beatrice." Marshall felt the world spin. "My wife was from Windsor. She told me she had trouble speaking as a child, that a special teacher helped her, but she never mentioned a name." Mrs. Amelia stood up and went to the window, her back to him. "I didn't know the family's surnames either. I didn't keep detailed records. It was all very informal. But when I saw your daughters, when I felt the connection, I thought it was just a coincidence. Until you mentioned the name Beatrice, and then it all made sense." "Are you saying that you," Marshall stammered, trying to process, "you saved my wife from the same silence that now afflicts my daughters?" Mrs. Amelia turned, her face bathed in tears. "I don't save anyone, Marshall. I just help people find themselves. But yes, I believe that Beatrice was your Beatrice, and now I am here somehow to help her daughters. The circle is complete." Marshall couldn't hold back his own tears. He stood up and hugged Mrs. Amelia, something he never would have imagined doing. The two cried together, united by the memory of a woman who connected them across time. When they finally separated, Marshall wiped his face. "Beatrice left diaries, many of them. They're all stored in the wardrobe in our room. I never had the courage to read them, but maybe I should. Maybe there are answers there." That same night, after everyone was asleep, Marshall went up to the room he had once shared with his wife, which he now kept closed like an untouchable sanctuary. He opened the mahogany wardrobe and found the boxes, 5 in total, organized by year. He chose one at random and began to read. Beatrice's delicate handwriting filled page after page with thoughts, memories, reflections, and then he found it. An entry dated 1995, the year they met. She wrote about her childhood, about the trauma of losing her mother, about the years of silence. And there, on a page stained with what looked like old tears, it was written, "Mrs. Amelia taught me that silence is not absence, it is concentrated presence. It is a form of speaking as valid as any other. She taught me to love myself even when I couldn't express myself. I owe her more than words can say. One day, if I have children, I want them to know the woman who gave me back my voice." Marshall closed the diary, holding it against his chest. Beatrice knew. Somehow she knew this would happen, that her daughters would face the same challenge, and that Mrs. Amelia, in some mystical or providential way, would be there again. He had to show this to her. He needed Mrs. Amelia to know that she wasn't here by chance, that her presence was not a coincidence, but destiny. A destiny written by hands that were no longer in this world, but that still acted through memory and love. The revelation from the diary changed everything. The next morning, Marshall awoke with a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He came down to breakfast carrying the brown, leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with time but carefully preserved. Mrs. Amelia was already in the kitchen, as had become her custom, making toast and fresh orange juice. The girls were playing in the garden, visible through the window, their silent laughter filling the space with a joy that had seemed impossible weeks ago. "I need you to read this," Marshall said, holding out the diary. Mrs. Amelia wiped her hands on a borrowed apron and took the volume with reverence. She immediately recognized the handwriting. Her hands trembled. "Beatrice," she murmured. "She wrote." Marshall nodded. "A lot. She left 20 years of memories recorded. And there are passages about you, about what you meant in her life." Mrs. Amelia sat down slowly, as if her legs could suddenly not support the weight of this discovery. She opened the diary to the marked page and began to read. Marshall watched her face transform. Surprise, emotion, pain, gratitude. When she finished, she closed the book gently and looked at Marshall with eyes full of tears. "I didn't know. I never imagined I had been so important to her. I thought I was just another child I had helped who had forgotten me." "You marked her life," Marshall said, sitting beside her. "And now you're marking the lives of her daughters. This isn't a coincidence, Mrs. Amelia. It's a gift that Beatrice somehow left for us." The woman wiped her tears with the back of her hand. "Or a responsibility," she replied. "I'm afraid of failing again, of not being able to help them as I should, of leaving and making them worse off than they were." Marshall took her hand, a gesture that surprised them both. "You're already helping, more than all the specialists who have come through here have managed in years. The girls are coming back. They're opening up. They're living." Mrs. Amelia shook her head. "But for how long? I can't stay forever. This isn't my home. It's not my life. I'm just a traveler who has stopped at a temporary port." Marshall hesitated before saying what he truly felt. "What if it wasn't temporary? What if you stayed, not as a guest, but as part of this family? The girls need you. I need you." Mrs. Amelia stood up abruptly, moving away. "Marshall, you don't know what you're asking. I'm not who you think I am. I have a past. I have flaws. I have mistakes that can't be erased." "We all do," he countered, "but that doesn't define us. What defines us is what we do with the chances we're given. And this is a chance, for me, for you, for them." Mrs. Amelia looked out the window, watching the girls. Sophia was showing something to Laura, probably an insect or a flower. Helena held a stick and drew shapes in the dirt, simple scenes of a childhood that was finally beginning to unfold as it should. "Let me think," Mrs. Amelia asked, her voice weak. "It's a lot to process." Marshall respected her silence and stepped away. But deep down he knew something was being built there, something bigger than both of them, something that would transform not only their lives, but would touch others in ways they could not yet foresee. The peace, however, was brief. On the afternoon of that same day, while the girls were doing their lessons, with Julianne in the study, the doorbell rang. Marshall answered it to find two men in suits at the door. One of them, tall and with rectangular glasses, introduced himself as Dr. Reginald Foster, president of the Kensington Residents Association. The other, shorter and holding a black leather briefcase, was the association's lawyer. "Mr. Ames," Dr. Foster began with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I'm sorry to bother you, but we need to discuss a delicate situation." Marshall frowned. "What situation?" The man exchanged glances with the lawyer before continuing. "We've received some complaints from neighbors about the presence of a homeless person living on your property. Understand, we have nothing against charitable actions, but there are protocols, there are rules of cohabitation that must be respected." Marshall felt anger rise in his throat. "The person you're talking about is my guest. She is here of her own free will. I don't see how that is any of the association's business." Dr. Foster maintained a polite but firm tone. Mr. Ames, I understand your position, but you must understand that we live in a neighborhood with certain standards. The presence of people who do not fit the profile can devalue properties, create insecurity, and attract others in similar situations. Marshall took a step forward, invading the man's personal space. Are you telling me I should evict an elderly lady who is helping my daughters because some prejudiced neighbors don't like the way she looks? The lawyer intervened, opening his briefcase. Mr. Ames, there are legal issues here. If this person does not have proper documentation, if there is no formal employment relationship, we could have problems with social services, child protective services. Someone might interpret this as a risk to the children. The threat was clear. Marshall clenched his fists. Are you threatening me? Dr. Foster raised his hands in a placating gesture. It's not a threat. It's a warning. We want to prevent this from becoming a bigger problem. Perhaps if the lady is relocated to a suitable shelter with professional assistance, everyone will be satisfied. Your daughters remain well cared for, and the community maintains its harmony. Marshall was about to respond when he felt a presence behind him. It was Mrs. Amelia, who had appeared silently. She looked at the two men with a dignity that made them involuntarily step back. Don't worry, she said, her voice calm but laden with sadness. I will leave. I don't want to cause problems for anyone. Marshall turned to her, desperate. No, you're not going anywhere. They have no right to decide this. But Mrs. Amelia was already heading up the stairs back to her room. Dr. Foster seized the opportunity. I see the lady is sensible. It's better this way, Mr. Ames, for everyone involved. And with that, the two of them left, leaving Marshall seething with anger and impotence at the door. He ran up the stairs after Mrs. Amelia and found her packing her few belongings into the small blue backpack. No, he repeated, you're not leaving like this, not because of them. Mrs. Amelia continued folding her shawl, her movements mechanical. Marshall, I already knew this would happen. It always does. People like me don't fit in places like this. It's the natural order of things. It's not natural at all, he exploded. It's injustice. It's prejudice. It's fear disguised as civility. She stopped and looked at him. But it's real, and I will not put your daughters at risk. If child services come, if they start investigations, you could lose them. And that I would never allow. Marshall sat on the bed, defeated. There has to be a way, some legal way to solve this. Documents, contracts, something to legitimize your presence here. Mrs. Amelia smiled sadly. I don't have documents, Marshall. I lost everything in the fire. My ID, my diploma, everything. To the system, I'm invisible, and maybe it's better that way. That night, Mrs. Amelia left. She didn't tell the girls. She simply waited until everyone was asleep and slipped out the back door, leaving only a short note on the kitchen table. Thank you for letting me be part of something beautiful, even for a short time. Take care. The girls are special, never forget that. There was no signature. There were no promises of return. Marshall found the note the next morning and felt as if he'd been punched in the stomach. He ran to the guest room, which was impeccably tidy, the bed made with perfect corners, no trace of anyone having been there besides the faint scent of lavender she used. He went to the window and looked out at the street. The mulberry tree was there, but beneath it there was no one, only dry, leaves scattered by the wind. The girls woke up and immediately sensed her absence. Sophia ran to the living room window, searching. Laura went to the garden, where Mrs. Amelia used to sit with them. Helena just stood in the middle of the room, hugging her teddy bear, her eyes fixed on nothing. And then it began. The regression. Sophia stopped making sounds. Laura stopped humming. Helena shut down completely again. In a matter of hours, all the progress of weeks was erased. Mrs. Davies tried everything. Favorite games, special foods, cartoons. Nothing worked. The girls refused to eat, refused to leave their room. They sat together on the bed, huddled together in a silence that now seemed final. Julianne came for an emergency visit and was horrified. Mr. Ames, they are in a state of profound grief. They need Mrs. Amelia. Without her, they are regressing in a way that could be irreversible. Marshall spent the next 3 days searching. He went to shelters, day centers, hospitals. He showed photos he had taken of Mrs. Amelia with the girls in the garden. No one had seen her. It was as if she had dissolved into thin air. On the fourth night, desperate, he went to an area of the city known for its open drug use, a place he avoided but where he knew many homeless people gathered. He didn't find her, but he spoke to some who knew of her. A lady like that? Yes, I've seen her. She usually stays near Leicester Square, or sometimes in the Bloomsbury area. It was on the morning of the 5th day that Marshall finally located her. She was in an abandoned building on Limehouse Lane, a structure that had once been elegant but was now just a shell of concrete and shattered hopes. She was on the first floor, huddled in a corner, covered by the plaid blanket. When she saw Marshall, she tried to get up, but he knelt beside her first. "Please," he said, his voice broken, "come back. The girls need you. I need you. I don't care about the association, the neighbors, anything. We'll sort out the documents. We'll make it legal. Just don't leave like this." Mrs. Amelia shook her head, weak. "Marshall, I am a problem. Where I go, conflict follows. It's always like this." He took her hands. "Then we'll face the conflict, together. But not here, not alone, not after everything we've done." Something in his gaze convinced her, or perhaps it was exhaustion, or the memory of the girls, or simply the realization that some bonds cannot be broken without consequences. "All right," she whispered. "I'll come back. But you have to promise me one thing." "Anything," Marshall replied. "Promise me that if things get too difficult, you will let me leave, not out of abandonment, but for protection." He hesitated, but then nodded. "I promise." Mrs. Amelia's return was like watching flowers bloom after a long winter. The girls, who had been listless and distant, exploded with joy when they saw her walk through the gate. They ran down the staircase, their bare feet pattering on the cold marble, and threw themselves at her with such force that the four of them nearly fell. Mrs. Davies wept openly. Julianne, who was present, just watched with the smile of someone witnessing something rare and precious. But Marshall knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a bigger battle. That same afternoon, he called a meeting with his personal lawyer, Dr. Henry Moore, a competent man who had worked with the family for decades. He explained the situation. "I need to regularize her presence in the house. An employment contract, a permanent visa if necessary, anything that prevents her from being removed." Dr. Moore listened attentively, taking notes. "The situation is complex, Marshall. Without documents, she is legally invisible. But there are solutions. We can start by applying for a replacement ID, using witnesses and old records. If she really worked as a teacher, there must be some record with the Department for Education. With documentation in hand, we create a formal contract. She becomes an employee of the household. That solves the legal issue." "And the association?" Dr. Moore smiled. "The association has no legal power to determine who lives in your house, as long as there is no violation of local or national laws. If she is regularized, they can't do anything." Marshall felt immense relief. "Then let's do it as soon as possible." The process began. Dr. Moore started the search for records. They discovered that Mrs. Amelia had indeed been a teacher in Windsor, registered with the old local education authority. Her full name was Amelia Rose Smith. She had worked for nearly 30 years in early childhood education before the fire that destroyed her school. With this information, they were able to apply for new documents. The process would take weeks, maybe months, but it was underway. Meanwhile, Dr. Reginald Foster did not remain idle. He began a quiet campaign in the neighborhood. Discreet meetings with other residents, casual comments at the club, insinuations about the children's safety. He was skilled at planting doubts without making direct accusations. Marshall noticed when he started getting strange looks on the street, when other parents at the girls' special school began to avoid him, when the manager of the neighboring apartment building suggested, with a sickly smile, that he reconsider his domestic choices. The last straw came when a social worker showed up at the door. "It was a routine visit," explained the woman in a beige suit and black briefcase. "We received an anonymous tip about a possible situation of vulnerability. involving children at this address. Marshall let her in, containing his rage. Mrs. Amelia was in the garden with the girls, teaching them how to plant sunflower seeds. The social worker observed the scene for long minutes, asked questions about their routine, diet, and medical care. Marshall answered everything with forced patience. At the end, the woman closed her notebook. "Mr. Ames, I see nothing wrong here. Your daughters appear well cared for, healthy and happy. But I must warn you, if there are further reports, other visits will be necessary. And if at any point the situation is deemed inadequate, measures will be taken." Marshall nodded, tense. "I understand. There is no inadequacy, just a family taking care of each other." When the social worker left, Marshall knew he had to act. He couldn't just stay on the defensive waiting for the next attack. He needed to turn the tables. And the solution came from an unexpected place. Mrs. Amelia, sitting at the kitchen table that night, opened her old fabric bag and took out a rusty metal box. Inside were dozens of letters. Letters from former students, from grateful parents, from fellow teachers. Some dated back decades, others were more recent, from before the fire. "I've always kept these," she explained. "They are the only proof that my work meant something." Marshall picked up one of the letters and read it. It was from a mother thanking her because her son had finally managed to say "I love you" after months of therapy with Mrs. Amelia. He picked up another. A young adult telling how his life had changed after she helped him overcome a severe stutter in childhood. And another. And another. Dozens of stories of transformed lives. An idea began to form in Marshall's mind. "Mrs. Amelia, do you know where these people are now?" She shrugged. "Some, yes. Others, no. It's been so long." Marshall took her hand. "What if we found these people? What if they told their stories publicly, in front of the association, in front of the neighbors, in front of everyone who doubts you?" Mrs. Amelia's eyes widened. "Marshall, that would be exposing my life, my past." He agreed. "It would, but it would also be showing who you really are. And maybe, just maybe, it will inspire other people to see beyond appearances." Mrs. Amelia hesitated, but then she looked at the girls sleeping in the living room, curled up in blankets on the sofa, exhausted after a day full of discoveries. "All right," she said. "Let's try." The work of locating the people mentioned in the letters was arduous but revealing. Marshall hired a private investigator, a discreet man named Paul who had worked for the construction company on land dispute cases. With the names from the letters and a few clues about locations, Paul began to track them down. He discovered that many of Mrs. Amelia's former students still lived in the home counties. Some had moved to the capital, others had built families, careers, and entire lives on the foundation she had helped them build. The first contact was with Robert Simpson, now a 42-year-old speech therapist working at a renowned clinic in South London. When Marshall called and mentioned the name Amelia Rose Smith, there was a silence on the other end of the line. Then an emotional voice. "Is this about Professor Amelia, the one who worked near Reading?" Marshall confirmed. Robert began to cry on the phone. "I've spent my life looking for her. I wanted to thank her. I wanted her to know that I became who I am because of her." The second contact was with Patricia Lewis, a 38-year-old lawyer living in Cambridge. She also became emotional upon hearing the name. "Professor Amelia was the only one who believed I could speak normally," she said. "I had severe selective mutism. My parents had already lost hope. She never did. She worked with me every day for a whole year. When I started speaking again, it was by saying her name. It was my first word in 3 years." One by one, the contacts were made. Charles, who was now a music teacher at a state school in Windsor. Marina, who worked as an occupational therapist near Birmingham. Ferdinand, the owner of a small bookshop in Reading. Julia, a child psychologist in Southampton. They all had a story. They all owed something to Mrs. Amelia, and all of them, without exception, accepted the invitation to participate in a public meeting Marshall was organizing. The idea was bold. Marshall proposed holding an open event at the mansion itself, inviting not only the former students, but also the neighborhood, the local press, and members of the Residents' Association. It would be a collective testimony, a celebration of a life dedicated to helping others, and also a response to the veiled accusations and prejudices disguised as concern. Dr. Reginald Foster, upon receiving the formal invitation, replied with disdain, "Mr. Ames, I see no need for this kind of spectacle. If you wish to prove something, do so through the appropriate legal channels." Marshall, however, was tired of playing by others' rules. "This is not a spectacle, Doctor. It's the truth, and the truth doesn't need a stage. It just needs to be seen. You are invited. The choice to attend is yours." News of the event spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some neighbors showed genuine curiosity, others discomfort. The local press, always on the lookout for human interest stories, expressed interest. A reporter from the Times called asking for an interview. Marshall accepted, but with one condition, that Mrs. Amelia also participate. The interview took place 3 days before the event. The reporter, a young man named Andrew, sat with them both in the living room. He asked questions about how they met, about Mrs. Amelia's work, about the girls. Mrs. Amelia answered with disarming humility. "I was just doing my job," she would say. "The children always had their voices. I just helped them find the courage to use them." When Andrew asked about the fire that had destroyed her school, she hesitated. "It was a loss," she admitted. "But the people I helped are still alive, and as long as my work wasn't destroyed. It was just scattered." The article came out 2 days before the event, occupying half a page in the city section. The headline was, "The Invisible Teacher Who Taught Through Silence." There were photos of Mrs. Amelia with the girls in the garden, of Marshall holding Beatrice's diaries, of the former students who would be honored. The response was immediate. The house phone didn't stop ringing. People wanting to know more, offering support, telling their own stories of overcoming adversity. On the morning of the event, the mansion was transformed. Marshall hired a small team to set up chairs in the garden, prepare a discreet sound system, and arrange tables with coffee and pastries. Mrs. Davies commanded the kitchen like a general, preparing scones, sausage rolls, cheese straws, and sponge cakes. The girls, dressed in matching outfits, ran around the garden supervising everything with the seriousness of miniature adults. Mrs. Amelia, for her part, was nervous. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress that Marshall had bought for her, and her hair was in an impeccable bun. "I don't know if I can do this," she confessed to Marshall, as they watched the preparations from the window. "Expose my life like this." He placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do anything but be yourself. People just need to see you. The rest they will understand on their own." The guests began to arrive at 3 in the afternoon. First came the former students. Robert, the speech therapist, arrived with his wife and 2 young children. When he saw Mrs. Amelia, he ran across the garden and hugged her tightly. "Professor," he said, crying, "I never forgot. Never." She returned the hug, also crying. "Robert, you've grown so much. You've become a handsome man." Patricia arrived shortly after, carrying a bouquet of white flowers. "These are for you," she said. "I've wanted to give you flowers for years. Now I finally can." One by one, the others arrived. Charles brought his guitar and offered to play during the event. Marina brought old photos of the school, miraculously saved because they were at her house when the fire happened. Ferdinand brought books, saying that half of his bookshop existed because Mrs. Amelia had taught him to love words even when he couldn't pronounce them properly. Julia brought a long, detailed, handwritten letter narrating how Mrs. Amelia's teaching philosophy had influenced her own work as a psychologist. Neighbors also appeared, some out of curiosity, others in solidarity. Mrs. Clarice, the lady who lived 3 houses down and had always been kind to the girls, came with a lemon drizzle cake. Mr. Anthony, the retired doorman from the building on the corner, showed up in a suit, saying that important events deserved proper attire. Even some of the people who had complained came, perhaps out of social pressure, perhaps out of a genuine interest in understanding what they were missing. Dr. Reginald Foster, arrived last, accompanied by the association's lawyer. Both maintained neutral expressions, but Marshall noticed the discomfort in their eyes as they saw the number of people present. There were easily 100 guests in the garden, perhaps more. The press was there, with photographers and reporters taking notes. It was too late to back down. Marshall stepped onto a small, improvised stage and asked for attention. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I know many of you are curious about the reason for this gathering. Others already know, but you are all here because, in one way or another, you believe that stories matter, and today we are going to tell a story. The story of a woman who dedicated her life to giving a voice to those who had none. The story of Mrs. Amelia." He then invited the former students to speak. One by one, they took the stage and shared their testimonies. Robert told how Mrs. Amelia would spend hours with him after school, creating personalized exercises, never giving up even when progress was minimal. Patricia recounted how the teacher would come to her house on Saturdays without charging extra, because she knew the girl needed continuous support. Charles played a song he had composed in her honor, a simple but moving melody about finding one's own voice. Marina showed the old photos. There were images of the school before the fire. It was a humble but welcoming place, with colorful walls and well-tended gardens, smiling children, dedicated teachers, a project of love that had been reduced to ashes but remained alive in the memory of all who had passed through it. Ferdinand read excerpts from books that had marked his life, explaining how each had been a recommendation from Mrs. Amelia. Julia spoke about how she applied the principles learned from the teacher in her daily work, helping other children overcome their fears and blocks. When they had all finished, there were few dry eyes in the audience. Even Dr. Foster seemed shaken, though he tried to maintain his composure. Marshall then asked Mrs. Amelia to come up. She hesitated, but the girls gently pushed her. Sophia held her right hand, Laura her left, and Helena stood behind, pushing her back. The three guided her to the stage, like little guardians. Mrs. Amelia looked at the crowd. She took a deep breath. "I don't know what to say," she began, her voice trembling. "I've spent my life trying to be invisible, trying not to be a bother, trying to carry my mistakes in silence. But these people," she gestured to the former students, "remind me that maybe my life was worth something, that maybe I left seeds that continued to grow even when I thought everything was dead." She looked at Marshall. "This man welcomed me when I was a nobody, when I had nothing to offer but memories and failures. He saw something in me that I no longer saw in myself, and these girls," she looked at Sophia, Laura, and Helena, "these beautiful children taught me that connections don't need words, that love doesn't need an explanation, that sometimes just being present is enough." Her voice broke. "I lost everything once, my school, my work, my identity. I thought it was the end, but now I realize I didn't lose it. It just changed form. What I taught lived on in each of you," she said, gesturing again to the guests. "And now I see that I can start again, not in the same way, but in a new way if you'll let way. Me." It was then that Marshall made the announcement he had prepared. "Mrs. Amelia, this isn't just an event to clear your name. It's the beginning of something bigger. With your permission, I want to turn this house into a center for children with communication difficulties, a place where they can be heard without having to fit into molds, where silence is respected as a form of expression, not as a problem to be fixed. And I want you to run this center, to make it what your old school was, a safe harbor." The crowd erupted in applause. Mrs. Amelia brought her hands to her face, crying openly. Dr. Foster tried to protest, raising his hand to speak, but he was drowned out by the applause and shouts of support. A neighbor shouted, "I support the initiative." Another, "This neighborhood needs more love and less prejudice." The lawyer pulled Dr. Foster by the arm, whispering something. The association president seemed to realize he had lost the battle. Without a word, he and the lawyer discreetly withdrew, walking quickly towards the gate as the applause continued. In the following days, the response was enormous. The article in the paper was shared thousands of times on social media. Volunteers began to offer to help with the project. Professionals in speech therapy, psychology, education and occupational therapy called, offering their services for free or at symbolic rates. Donations of materials, books, toys and equipment began to arrive. In less than 2 weeks, Marshall had more support than he knew how to manage. Dr. Moore, the lawyer, handled the bureaucracy. He created a non-profit foundation called the Beatrice Ames Institute in honor of Marshall's late wife. Mrs. Amelia was registered as the pedagogical director, with all her documents now properly regularized. The mansion was adapted. The upper floor remained the family residence, but the ground floor was transformed into activity rooms, a library, an art space, and a therapeutic garden. The first children arrived 3 months later. There were 5 of them, referred by different institutions. A 6-year-old girl with partial hearing loss and language difficulties, a 4-year-old boy on the autism spectrum who communicated mainly through drawings, 7-year-old twins with a speech development delay, and a 12-year-old girl with selective mutism who hadn't spoken outside her home in 2 years. Mrs. Amelia worked with each one individually, but also in groups. She created activities that mixed therapy with play, learning with acceptance. She taught that communication goes beyond the voice, that sign language is as valid as spoken language, that drawings, music, dance, and even silence are legitimate forms of expression. Sophia, Laura, and Helena became unofficial assistants, helping the new students feel at ease, showing that it was possible to live fully, even without following expected patterns. And then it happened. What everyone had hoped for, but no one dared to force. It was a sunny spring afternoon, 6 months after the project began. Mrs. Amelia was in the garden with a group of children planting lavender seedlings. Sophia was beside her, helping to dig small holes in the earth. And suddenly, clear as a bell, Sophia's voice rang out. "Grandma Mila, where do I plant this one?" Everyone stopped. The garden fell completely silent. Mrs. Amelia turned slowly, her eyes wide. "What did you say, little one?" Sophia smiled, holding the seedling. "Grandma Mila. It's your name." Laura and I decided. Helena agreed. "Where do I plant this lavender?" It was the first full sentence Sophia had ever spoken, and she had chosen to use it to give Mrs. Amelia a new name, a name of affection, a name of belonging. Mrs. Amelia dropped her trowel, hugged Sophia, and cried as she hadn't cried in decades. Marshall, watching from the veranda, ran down the stairs and joined the hug. Soon Laura and Helena arrived too, followed by the other children, creating a large group hug in the middle of the flowering garden. In the following weeks, the 3 began to talk more and more. Short sentences at first, then longer ones, full conversations, questions, laughter with sound. It was as if a dam had broken and now the water flowed, freely and abundantly. Julianne, the educator, was amazed. "It's the environment," she explained to Marshall. "They finally feel safe. They feel they can be heard. And with Mrs. Amelia here, they have the perfect model that it's possible to communicate in many ways, and all are valid." The institute grew. In its first year, it served 20 children. In the second, 50. By the third, there was a waiting list and plans for expansion. Marshall reduced his workload at the construction firm to dedicate more time to the project. He discovered that building bridges between people was as gratifying as building buildings. Mrs. Amelia, now over 80, remained active and present, though she agreed to hire more teachers to share the workload. The girls, now 8 years old, were exemplary students in a mainstream school. They spoke 3 languages, including British Sign Language, which they learned to communicate with some of the Institute's students. They put on theatre performances to raise funds. They gave interviews to the press about the importance of inclusion. They became little ambassadors of a simple but powerful message. Everyone has something to say. We just need to give them the space to say it in their own way. Dr. Reginald Foster never formally apologized, but years later, when his own grandson was diagnosed with apraxia of speech, he came to the Institute for help. Mrs. Amelia received him without resentment. He walked through the door with the boy by the hand, accepted coffee prepared by Mrs. Davies, and sat in the same room where he had once been hostile. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice heavy. I judged without knowing. I feared without reason. Mrs. Amelia just nodded. We all do that at some point. The important thing is to learn. Your grandson will be welcome here. The years passed, bringing change and growth. Marshall eventually fell in love again with Claire, a volunteer speech therapist at the Institute. They married in a simple ceremony in the house's garden, with the girls as bridesmaids and Mrs. Amelia as the matron of honor. The life that had once seemed frozen in grief now pulsed with possibilities. Mrs. Amelia, who insisted on continuing to live in the guest room despite being considered part of the family, woke up every day before sunrise. She made coffee in the old coffee pot. She sat on the veranda and watched the city awaken, and she gave thanks. She was thankful for being found, for being seen, for being given a second chance to do what she had always known how to do best: help children discover their own voices, whether audible or not. One Sunday afternoon, years after it all began, Marshall found Mrs. Amelia sitting under the mulberry tree in front of the house. It was the same spot where everything had started. He sat down beside her. "What are you thinking about, Grandma Mila?" She smiled at the nickname the whole family now used. "I'm thinking that life is strange. I spent years trying to be invisible, and in the end I discovered that being seen was the only way to truly live." Marshall nodded. Beatrice knew that. That's why she left those diaries. That's why, somehow, she guided you to us. Mrs. Amelia looked up at the cloudless blue sky. "Do you think she's proud of what we've done?" Marshall didn't hesitate. "I'm absolutely certain. Her daughters are happy. They have voices. They have purpose. And dozens of other children have been helped because of what we built. Beatrice couldn't have wished for anything better." Mrs. Amelia wiped away a tear that trickled down her wrinkled face. Then it was worth it. Every difficult moment, every night in the cold, every doubt, it was all worth it. From where they sat, they could hear the voices of the children in the garden. Sophia teaching a new song to the little ones, Laura playing the flute while others danced, Helena reading a story aloud, her perfect diction the result of years of practice and love. The sound that had once been missing from that house now overflowed, spreading through the neighborhood like waves of hope. And so, in the place where impenetrable silence once lived, a chorus of diverse voices bloomed. Some spoken, some sung, some whispered, some signed. All equally valid, all equally beautiful. Because Mrs. Amelia had taught the most important thing, that being heard depends not only on who speaks, but on who is willing to truly listen. And in that house, transformed into a sanctuary of acceptance, everyone was heard, everyone was seen, everyone belonged. Love, when it finds space to flourish, transforms even what seemed beyond repair. And sometimes that transformation begins with a silent presence under a tree, waiting patiently to be noticed, waiting to show that miracles don't have to be loud. Sometimes the greatest miracles whisper. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Marshall, Mrs. Amelia, and the three girls has deeply touched your hearts. If you were moved by this journey of love, new beginnings, and overcoming adversity, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment stood out to you the most. Was it Sophia's first word, Mrs. Amelia's reunion with her former students, or the transformation of the house into a place of acceptance? Every day, we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest and truest side of the human soul, showing that it's never too late to start over, and that love has the power to heal even the oldest wounds. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with another story that will make you reflect on life, family, and the bonds that unite us. Until next time.